Hi, folks. It's Dr. Gianna Reams, and today we're going to talk about Alexander's heroes. That is, if Alexander was looked back at by Caesar, Napoleon, etc., as a hero, someone they wanted to emulate, who did Alexander himself want to emulate? It might not be the person you think, depending on how much time and where you spend that time on the internet. Um, if you run a quick search on Alexander and heroes, you're probably going to trip over references to Alexander as the new Achilles. Okay. And especially if you add into this references to Hephaestion, then you're really going to trip over Alexander as Achilles and Hephaestion as Patroclus, and this whole Patrochilles fandom that wants then to see Alexander and Hephaestion as somehow a real life example of this relationship. And a lot of that owes, of course, to the popularity of this novel, The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. Um, and I'm probably going to piss off a lot of the Patrochilles fans right now by saying, yeah, no. There's not really much historical basis for that. There's problems even with overemphasizing Alexander as the new Achilles. Never mind Hippaeus as Patroclus. There are only a handful of references in the ancient sources. Now, that said, and before everybody freaks out, I am not saying Alexander never compared himself to Achilles. He did. Okay. And I'm also not saying that Alexander and Hephaestion weren't lovers. They quite probably were, certainly in their youth. So please don't go 0 to 60 and to extremes. What I am saying is that the comparison of Alexander to Achilles and Hephaestion to Patroclus may not have been all that important to them. There are some even who would argue that this was made after their deaths and not during their own lifetime. All right. I'm not sure I'd go quite that far, but I do think that it gets exaggerated too much. Okay. Which leaves us with this question of, okay, then, who was Alexander's hero? Who did he emulate? That is Heracles. Okay. And this is important too. Now, Alexander believed himself to be a descendant of Achilles on his mother's side and of Heracles on his father's side. So when it comes down to inheriting the throne, Heracles is more important than that, okay, than Achilles is. So the importance of these two in his own lifetime, okay, would have elevated Heracles far more than Achilles. And that is, in fact, what we see represented in the ancient sources, as well as in Alexander's own iconography. In other words, the images of Alexander and his own coinage. That's who we're looking at. Not Achilles. He's not making references to Achilles. He's making references to Heracles. Okay. And we'll go take a look at those at the end. But I want to start then with, how do I know that? Okay. Why do you make that claim? Folks, I did this really boring thing. I read through all of the ancient sources, and especially the Big Five, and I counted references, okay, to Heracles, to Achilles, to Dionysus, to some of the other gods as well. And it was very interesting. If you want to really know things, you need to look at the evidence. What does the evidence say? So let me give it to you. In Justin, our shortest source, Heracles, and let me say one other thing. Whenever I'm referencing these heroes, I am referencing not just mentions of them, but actual connections made between Alexander and that hero, that there is a comparison being made. They're not just being named. Okay. So Alexander as, or Alexander emulating. So in Justin, Alexander and Hercules 4 times. Alexander and Dionysus 3 times. Alexander and Achilles only twice. That's not a lot for any of them. It's a short book. Plutarch, okay, Our second shortest. He is the only one that has Achilles and Alexander referenced more than Alexander and Heracles. And Achilles, 3 times, okay? Hercules, twice. Dionysus, 3 times, okay? Notice I'm throwing Dionysus in here for a reason. Then we get to Diodorus. Diodorus is in the middle. And in Diodorus, Alexander's compared to Heracles 6 times. He's compared to Dionysus twice. And he's compared to Achilles 3 times. Then we get to the long ones. In Curtius, Alexander is compared to Heracles 9 times. He is compared to Dionysus 7 times. He's compared to Achilles once. And it's not in a good way. Okay, and this is important. Curtius compares Alexander, makes a comparison between the two. When Alexander is pulling the body, or pulling Battus, he's not dead yet, behind his chariot around the walls of Gaza, just like Achilles supposedly pulled the body already dead of Hector. So it's not a good comparison. Now, to be fair, Curtius is missing the first 2 books. So we don't have Alexander's arrival at Troy. Maybe, probably, there would have been a reference to Alexander and Achilles in there. Okay. In that we get this whole list of everybody that he sacrifices to. Then Arian. And in Arian, Alexander's compared to Heracles 12 times, to Dionysus 7 times, and to Achilles only 4. Okay, or in these kind of significant comparisons. Now, why then is there this persistent idea of Alexander as a new Achilles and of Hephaestion as Patroclus, other than it's romantic? Okay, and here I am squelching all the romance. I'm harshing your squee. I'm sorry. Not really. Okay, we need to look at the history. Some of this has to do with the prominence of Alexander's visit to Troy in Arian, combined with the popularity of Arian. The 2 most popular histories of Alexander is Arrian's Anabasis and Plutarch's Life of Alexander. And these are the 2 where we get a little bit more about Alexander as Achilles. Okay. But I would carefully note that, in Arian, Heracles is more important. And Plutarch's an outlier. Plutarch's the only one that mentions Achilles more than Heracles. And Arian focuses on Troy for a reason, and it's not because of Achilles. It's because of Homer. All right? So the visit to Troy that is described in Arian is Book 1, Chapter 11, beginning with line 1, all the way through Chapter 12, line 5. So if you want to go read it for yourself, that's where it is. This, especially 12, 2-5, is regarded as the second preface. Okay, what does that mean? A preface is where Arian lays out what he's doing and who his sources are, etc. So the beginning preface, he tells you who are the people he trusts, Ptolemy and Aristobulus, and other things, and why he trusts them, etc. But then in this second preface, he tells you why he's writing the history. Okay? He wants to be the new Homer. All right? Now, whenever he is lining up all the sacrifices, Achilles is only one of them. He gives a whole list. Okay? So just a reminder, Macedonian kings are the high priests, so they are responsible for making sacrifices at certain points in a campaign. When you set out, when you cross bodies of water, when you land, sometimes when you enter cities. So there are specific places where you are expected to give a sacrifice. And Alexander does them. He gives a sacrifice before he leaves. He builds an altar, Arian tells us, and he makes a sacrifice to this guy, Patrochilles. Okay, who is that? He is the first Greek, okay, or Achaean, to set foot on the shore at Troy. And he dies. Okay, he's killed immediately. This is not, by the way, in Homer's Iliad, but this is part of the mythos, so everyone knew who this was. And so Alexander makes a sacrifice to this guy's shade, hoping for a better landing whenever they get there. Then halfway across, he stops and he makes a sacrifice to Poseidon and the Nereids. Again, this is part of the standard expectations. Then when he lands, he makes yet another sacrifice, builds an altar, makes a sacrifice to Zeus, protector of landings, as well as to Athena and to Heracles. Okay. Heracles, notice. Then they go up to Troy, where he acts as a sightseer. And while he is there, he does a couple of things. One is he makes a sacrifice to Priam. Why? So that Priam, the soul of Priam, won't be mad at them reinvading Asia. Okay. And also to Athena of Troy. Okay. So remember that gods had different aspects in different places. So Athena of Troy in particular, he goes in, he dedicates his own armor. He must have had two sets here. And then he takes some of the armor from the temple that was supposedly connected to Troy. Now, time out to make one very important point. Maybe the Trojan War happened. Maybe. The way it's described in Homer is not how it happened. All right? There was no Achilles. There was no Agamemnon. There was no Helen. Okay? These are fictional characters in a novel, not unlike this one. Okay? So they're characters. We know that. Okay? So whatever the heck Alexander was given is nothing that actually came from the war, probably not. But the ancients absolutely believed that these heroes were real people. Okay. So it doesn't really matter what we think. They believed it. And Alexander believed that he was carrying the shield of Achilles. Okay. He was supposedly offered the lyre of Achilles. He didn't want that. Or the lyre of Paris, whose name, incidentally, was Alexandros. That's Alexander's name in Greek. And he's like, no, I don't want that. Give me the weapons of Achilles. And so he gets the shield of Achilles. And he has this carried before him, supposedly, in all of the major battles as kind of his standard, if you will. And once again, these almost certainly did not come from the war. But he thought they did. So he's doing all of this stuff. We haven't heard Achilles yet, have we? Okay. Except that he wants this shield. So he's given some things, Arian tells us. Last, Arian mentions that he lays a crown on the tomb of Achilles, and Hephaestion lays a crown on the tomb of Patroclus. And the way that this is described by Arian is of note. He says, some say. This is how Arian tells you, my trusted sources don't tell me this. This is other sources out there. And I think it might be true, so I'm going to include it. Okay. And periodically he will tell you these other stories. So this is one of those other stories. It's not from Ptolemy. It's not from Aristobulus. Arian's not sure if it's true. So this is very interesting. But why is he telling you this? And he's telling it to us for the last line. And he says that Achilles was lucky, that Alexander supposedly said in this account, that Achilles was lucky to have a Homer to preserve his great deeds. That is why Arian includes that story, because it is the segue into Arian telling you, oh, Alexander never had a Homer until now, and I am going to be that Homer. Okay. So he's setting himself up to be to Alexander what Homer was to Achilles. All right? That's where the story is. That's why it's included. Now, the other source that also gives a reference to this event is in Plutarch. In Plutarch, it's chapter 15, line 4, where he tells us that among the other things Alexander did at Troy, he stripped down with his friends and ran a race around the tomb of Achilles. And then he said, and it's a similar line, but Plutarch changes it. Plutarch says that Achilles said he was lucky to have a true friend, okay, which is presumably a reference to Hephaestion, but Hephaestion's not actually named there, okay? But that may be the same source that Plutarch is using, that Arian is using later, and he says, some say. We don't know who that source is. Maybe Clitarchus. Okay, that's a good guess. Maybe Callisthenes, who knows? We just don't know. But Plutarch says nothing about Hephaestion crowning the grave of Patroclus. And he doesn't even say they crowned the graves. He says they ran a race around them. Now, just a quick note. In the ancient world, there were three types of sacrifices that one could give. The first of those is a blooded sacrifice, which means you kill something. The second is a non-blooded, and that could be all sorts of things. It could be first fruits from your farm. It could be a lock of your hair. It could be your toys. It could be armor was a common one. It could be all kinds of things as votives or not even as votives, just as sacrifices. And these are usually inscribed, incidentally, at the temples. But there's a third type that gets overlooked, and that is actions. So people can dedicate an action to the gods. Warfare, sports is very popular, but there were other things one could do, and that's what is happening here. Alexander is dedicating the race to Achilles. So this is his sacrifice to Achilles. Did he also put a crown there? Maybe, but Plutarch doesn't say so. But these are the accounts of his time at Troy and this reference to Achilles, and then possibly to Hephaestion as Patroclus. We are missing the first two books of Curtius, so we don't have any long account from Curtius about Troy. So we have no idea what Curtius would have said. Diodorus mentions things, but it's very brief. And Justin just speeds right over it. Doesn't really tell us a lot. Now, if you're looking again at references to Hephaestion as Patroclus, they are really thin on the ground. There's only the one certain one from Arrian at Troy. Plutarch kind of alludes to it, probably from the same source that they're using. And then Arrian also references Patroclus and Hephaestion at Hephaestion's death. Okay. And he says this at 716-8. We also have a mention in Diodorus as well, which we'll come back to about the Kassians, when we're told about this in Plutarch that Alexander, or after Hephaestion's death, Alexander went and he fought these guys, the Kassians, and this is in chapter 72. And he says that Plutarch tells us that Alexander sacrificed 12 Kassians, a human sacrifice to the gods, just like Achilles had done for Patroclus, the shades. The problem is we get this same fight mentioned without any sacrifices. So Diodorus tells us about the fight in book 17, chapter 11, 4-6. He says he went out and he fought the Kassians. There's no mention in there at all of any sacrifices to Hephaestion. Polyaenus, which is a very late source, also mentions this battle with the Kassians in book 4, chapter 3, line 31. He calls it a balm for Alexander's grief, but he means the war. He also doesn't mention that there's any sacrifices going on. So Plutarch probably made that up. That this is one of the reasons in my video about Alexander's grieving, I said that probably didn't happen. There's only the one mention of it, very specifically. Diodorus mentions Hephaestion as Philtatos as well, which might be an allusion to Patroclus, but not necessarily. Philtatos just means dearest friend. That's all. So there's one other, and only one, anywhere else, of comparing Alexander to Achilles and Hephaestion to Patroclus, and that's another late source, Aelian, the Varia Historia, 12:7, that does make this same comparison between the two, which is often taken as an allusion in Aelian to them as lovers, because by that point in time, pretty much everybody in the ancient world understood and believed that Achilles and Patroclus had been lovers. Now, Arrian is really our chief source. Again, we've got these couple of allusions from Plutarch. We've got this very late one in Aelian. Arrian's discourses of Epictetus don't call Hephaestion Patroclus, but this is our only source that is blunt about calling Hephaestion Alexander's lover. He's called his Romanos, and that's 2:22:17-18. So if you want to go look it up, it's in there. This is one of the other preserved writings of Arrian. So this is the only place where we are flat told that Hephaestion and Alexander were lovers. Okay. So that gives you a kind of a window into the ancient evidence, and a lot of those mentions of Achilles that I was referring to in these other sources come related to Troy or related to Hephaestion's death. Otherwise, he's just not really mentioned except at Gaza, and that's not good, right? Instead, we get many, many more references to Alexander and Heracles. And we don't just get them in the sources, okay, in our five histories. We get them also in other surviving extant sources here and there, like the Moralia, Athenaeus. So there are other references comparing Alexander to Heracles. And then we have our visual evidence here. So part of why I wanted to use Zoom is so that I can share my screen and show you some of what I'm talking about of Alexander as Heracles. And the first one here is from the Alexander sarcophagus here, okay? And you can see Alexander wearing a lion skin helmet on his head, like Heracles. So making it a little bit bigger so you can see it. There you go, okay? Very clear Heracles reference. This would probably have been made not in Alexander's lifetime, but shortly after, so it's somewhat recent. Then also another example of Alexander as Heracles that dates closer to the time that he lived comes from this one. It's on a wine pourer, a rhyton, and it shows a Heracles that is suspiciously Alexander looking. Okay, it's a silver ornament from the royal tombs at Vergina. So this would have been, again, shortly after Alexander's lifetime. Okay. Then we have some others, like this one from the National Museum there in Athens, showing Alexander in the helmet, the Heracles helmet. And another similar one is this one as well. So again, an Alexander Heracles, meant to have Alexander look like Heracles. And then later, a really clear Alexander wearing, again, the lion skin helmet, like Heracles. And it's not just these images from sculpture. We get it, Alexander's own, okay, coinage. Okay, so this little coin here is an Alexander coin showing the head of Heracles. We also find these on Philip's coins. Okay, this one's from Colophon on the Asia Minor coast. It was minted in Alexander's lifetime, and Heracles is the Heracles-ish, but also maybe starting to look a little like Alexander. The more time goes on, the more we see Alexander become Heracles, or maybe Heracles become Alexander. Okay. So we've got this iconography that backs up our textual references, telling us who Alexander most wanted to be and to be seen as. So if you want to go say, who is Alexander cosplaying? It ain't Achilles, okay? Except maybe every once in a while. It's mostly Heracles. So Heracles takes the crown as Alexander's personal hero, the one Alexander emulates most. And of course, he understood and believed that Heracles was his ancestor. So being descended from Heracles is very important to him as a Macedonian king.